There has been a systematic disinformation campaign in the US. One of the courses I teach looks at why it is climate change is a controversial issue in the US. I think some of it is we have a baked in skepticism of science. It tends to oftentimes be politically linked. It used to be much more, if you said you were a scientist, you were seen as this dispassionate, impartial egghead who crunched the numbers to get at the truth. I think now it's seen as much more of a partisan affair, right? Like if you're doing science, you have an agenda, and it's either to sort of feather your own nest, right? If I say that there's no climate crisis and I don't get any more money to do climate research, and so I need to say there's a climate crisis so I get more money to do more research, or I'm sort of a closet socialist. And that has taken over some of it. But also, I think there's some of it's just groupthink, right? If somebody starts expressing skepticism and you don't know that much about it, then it either becomes kind of taboo to talk about, or why is it that people don't think we landed on the moon? People were up there saying, look, we didn't land on the moon. And I wasn't there, right? Like, I know what I saw on TV, but that's on TV. And so I think the vast majority of elections now are I mean, there are some, right? Some state Senate seats can be quite competitive, but in any state or federal, if you remember the House, where you have a carved out district, you can carve that in a whole bunch of ways. Unless states bake in the fact that this is a nonpartisan affair, a lot of times it's nakedly partisan. At that point, your only competitive election is your primary. Who are the people who turn out in primaries? It's hardcore members. If your hardcore members, even if they're the small minority of your population, want to hear you say something, then you have a choice to make. You can say, no, you guys are all wrong, and you're out. Or you can parrot what needs to be parroted. And then you're the Republican or Democratic nominee. And at that point, you're in, right? It doesn't matter because you're running against the other party. Right. So I think some of it is just, we'll say what they say so they can get job security. Yeah. Let's start with the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons was popularized by a guy by the name of Garrett Hardin, who gave the example. He borrowed it from a previous person. And so he gave the example of a town commons, which you tend to find up in New England, that was imported. And it was the idea that this was communal, collectively available land, normally in the center of the town. And it was designed so people could graze their own livestock. And so Hardin says, look, imagine you have a commons and it has a carrying capacity for the number of sheep that are on it. You exceed that carrying capacity and you know that you're going to start degrading your grass and it's going to hurt everybody. Eventually, you're going to run out of grass. Under his example, each herder has to make the decision whether to stick another sheep on there. They each have this rational calculation. Look, if I buy another sheep and I put it on the commons, that is my sheep. I can sell it, I can eat it, I can do whatever. I get all the benefit from that sheep. I put it on the commons, it's going to harm the commons, but that harm shared out among everybody. So I get all the benefit, I get a portion of the harm. I have the rational incentive to get that sheep and put it on there. So what stops me from doing it? Well, maybe I just want to do the right thing, but I know that every other person who owns sheep has this exact same rational incentive to do it. And I know that they're going to make the rational choice. So then I'm going to be a sucker and be the only one who isn't benefiting while I'm suffering the harm, or I'm going to be the jerk who puts it on there. But everybody else is going to be a jerk. So why don't I just be a jerk too?
It's like everybody is peeing in the pool.
Why don't I?
So I might as well pee in the pool too, because I don't want to be the sucker.
And so the idea here is that each person does it, right? Everybody adds a sheep, and then they have to make that same decision to add another sheep. And of course, they all add another sheep. And so you just keep adding sheep, and eventually your entire resource collapses, and then nobody has a place to graze their sheep anymore. And so Hardin's solution is there's two ways to do this. There's two ways to deal with this. One is you bring in the government who says, all right, each of you only gets this many sheep, or we carve up the commons and everybody gets their own little pasture, little fenced off thing, and you can put in as many sheep as you want because it's only harming you. Into your own little pasture, right? So that was the traditional way of doing it. A community-based approach says these kind of collapses are not inevitable. There are examples of communities taking care of common resources, fisheries, grazing lands, whatever, without having it collapse. So this is not an inevitable thing if you get your incentive structure and what we call institutions, to get your rules right. So Garrett Hardin envisioned some sort of overseeing what is often called the Leviathan, right? You bring in the heavy. It's no longer a community dealing with its own commons. You're bringing in the state. There's a police force. Maybe they're hired within your community, but they're not paid for by your community, right? You're bringing in the parent who's like, no, you don't get any more sheep and there's going to be punishments. And so There's a book, Governing the Commons, that was by Eleanor Ostrom. She ended up getting the Nobel Prize in economics. I went up there to study with her. But she did a bunch of case studies around the world of places that they've managed to deal with their own resources. And so they had their own governance stuff, but it was the self-governance. And she said, look, what do we find in common between these places that seem to have figured it out? And so she came up with some commonalities between them. But she always said there are no absolutes. Governing stuff is a messy proposition, and sometimes it's just not going to work very well. And so maybe you do need to bring in the higher up power, but you don't know. It's not an inevitable thing. I think certainly a lot of time, I mean, human-wildlife conflict, certainly, but I think environmental issues in general and a lot of our political issues end up as metaphors, right? It's not the human-wildlife conflict, the environmental discussion, the government discussion ends up being more about human-human conflict, right? Even people who say government has no role, most of them are actually not anarchists, right? I mean, that would be, I don't want any government. They want government on things that they feel government should be involved in. And they don't want government in things they feel government should not be involved. That tends to get wrapped up in the symbolism of what it is they're talking about. So human-wildlife conflict, when I look out and there's a Florida panther that's snacking on my livestock.
For your pet.
There's an Endangered Species Act that prohibits me from doing something. That is government intervention right there. Okay. But the problem is, it's not just that the panther is a wild cat. That panther is a broader metaphor between urban-rural conflicts, right? Who is it that cares about the panther? Well, it's some Prius driver in Miami who likes knowing that the panther exists, but has never seen a panther, will never see a panther, will never have to live with the impacts of a panther, and will freak out if there was a panther in her backyard. And so when I'm a rancher, and I'm saying some of this tongue in cheek, but I'm hoping my message comes through the jokey quality that I just said. If I'm a rancher, that's all wrapped up in that cat. It's a metaphor about liberal versus conservative, about urban, rural, about pick your issue. All of that is wrapped up in that conflict. Climate change in this country, certainly, it's not a rational argument about the science and the facts. It's Al Gore says it's happening and I can't stand that guy. And so that all gets wrapped up. It's the same thing that we see with COVID. COVID has become a metaphor for a political and ideological divide. When you have moral positions, let's take climate change out of it, environmental conflicts deal with how it is we fundamentally see the positions of humans in this world. And no amount of facts, I can't argue about the existence of God using facts. It doesn't matter, right? No amount of facts thrown at me by somebody who is religious. You know, the Big Bang, where on earth would all the material come from? I'm going to be like, I don't know, somewhere we haven't figured that out yet, right? It doesn't matter. Facts don't matter in that discussion. You can't beat somebody over the head who doesn't already accept the fact that climate change is happening and say, well, look at all the facts. Because it's not a factual argument. It's a moral argument couched in factual terms to try to make it seem like you're not having a moral argument. And there's one other bizarre thing about the human psyche, which is they've done experiments with people where they've said, okay, you have this belief, have a seat, and they show them reams of facts about why it is they are dead wrong. And they'll ask them about their belief. And the person, it solidifies. People are like, well, now I'm even more convinced. Right. And all it does is make them hunker down even more. And so that's the issue that you get here. And you get that through almost every type of environmental discussion, climate change, conservation, Endangered Species Act, human-wildlife conflict, all of it is oftentimes a manifestation of human-human conflict.
But there have to be some values beyond that.
The concept you're talking about is known as externalities. The way that capitalism traditionally views everything is it's a one-to-one exchange. So you sell shoes, I buy shoes from you for a certain price, right? I get benefits from those shoes, you get benefits from the sale. But the idea is the price that we land on reflects the impact of that transaction in its entirety. That's the way the traditional market works. All costs, all benefits, everything are wrapped up in the price of that shoes. The problem is, in reality, there's stuff that flows out either way.
Right.
Leather goes into that shoes. Well, okay. Yeah, you've arranged with a leather distributor, but maybe there are some trees cut down for the cows. Yep. There's carbon dioxide being produced in transportation.
So there's a cost that's not calculated.
And there's benefits too. Not all externality bad, right? So maybe I start walking more in my new pair of shoes. And so I'm less likely to get heart disease, and that saves the system money. There's goods and bads, but the goods and the bads that flow out to people, those are never calculated in traditional economic models. So when I buy a forest, what is calculated is the lumber of that sale of that wood, right? How much I could earn if I turned it into a golf course or if I turned it into a shopping center, or how many jobs that would provide. That's how we calculate things. The good externalities associated with that, the fact that you would get less soil erosion because I'd have a root network that would hold down carbon sequestration because the tree's growing and depositing carbon in its wood, cleaning the air, filtering water. All these things that are beneficial are not calculated. And all the bad things that could come about to society at large from me doing the activity, clearing it, and you get more still flowing into your rivers, those aren't calculated either. And so the incentive structure, the way it's set up right now, with how much I, sale, everything like that, it's designed on this premise that the only people that matter in me clearing this is me and whoever's going to be buying the services that I offer and the goods from that property. We don't incentivize doing the right thing and preserving it, because who's paying for that? I don't earn money off of that because the externalities aren't valued. That's why we have things like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, because then there's costs and penalties associated with doing terrible, horrible things. But we can get there, right? You could subsidize the ecosystem services. There's been attempts to do that, oftentimes on the international scale. So rich countries and rich companies in rich countries can pay developing areas to preserve their forests. That is essentially trying to do that. It's trying to put a value on the ecosystem services that are provided. But if that doesn't exist, then I have absolutely no incentive. People should pay me for my trees. But if I walked up to you and was like, buddy, you want to pay me for my trees? You'd tell me to go pound sand. That's just the way the system's set up. So there has to be a systematized way of doing that. But the way that the system is set up globally right now is generally there's no incentive, because I don't make money unless I exploit the resources. That's how we value things. And that's how the entire system is set up, because we weren't thinking about issues like climate change. I will just say, I would address your, what can any individual do? Like, I'm a person out of, what are we now, 6 billion or however many billion, what can I do? And my answer is individually nothing, right? Functionally. But the same issue exists with voting, right? Your individual vote is entirely irrelevant, almost all the way down to the community level. One vote is meaningless, but in the aggregate, it matters, right? And so to the extent that you get, in future, we can talk about why we tend to see policy change where we do. There's a whole bunch of literature that looks at the science behind policy change. The upshot is that policy change tends to be responsive, right? The people who create policy tend to respond to the attention of the public. And so, yeah, you individually are meaningless on something that is global as climate change, for example. But you and the aggregated efforts of lots of other people do matter. It can be easy to throw your hands up and go, well, I'm just banging my head against a wall. But you need a whole bunch of people to bang heads against walls, and then things can move. And so I think it is important to continue to care, because apathy sure isn't going to change anything.
I feel like we should have leaders that appreciate nature.
People tend to vote on bundles of issues, but oftentimes environment's third or fourth down on that list. It's jobs, it's security, it's whatever, and then environment. And so the lower down you are in the hierarchy, the more you're willing to compromise on it. And so if environment gets escalated up, so that happened recently in Germany, right? Concerns about climate change really impacted the outcome of the German election. It was the worst showing by Merkel's party, which had basically been in control since World War II, if I recall correctly. That's what focusing events kind of are in the literature is they're these short-term hyper focus, but it's really for people for whom that's not at the forefront of their mind. It comes to the forefront for a temporary period of time, and then it tends to recede back. How many people walk around thinking about offshore drilling until they're reading about the oil spill in California, post Deepwater Horizon and oil spill? Most people probably didn't walk around thinking about the potential risks of offshore drilling because it just kind of recedes into the background.